Welcome to another episode. Here we are in Tennessee. That's a big can of baked beans. We saw that just driving down the highway. Went by a Bush's Baked Beans factory. Great Smokey Mountains was our first main attraction in Tennessee. Beautiful country. Back in 1818, John Oliver was the first white settler to settle in the area. He settled and built a house in Cades Cove. Congress authorized the park in 1926, but because there was no funds available for it or no large tracts of federally owned land, the park was not created back then. Money for the park was donated by John D. Rockefeller. There was also some government money brought in, and private citizens covered the rest. And the park was officially dedicated by Franklin Roosevelt in 1940. We were there in the first part of November, so we still had some of the autumn colors in the trees, which is just beautiful back here. In 2021, 14.1 million people came to visit the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, making it the most visited national park in the country. So John Oliver, the first settler in the area, this is actually his house. He bought the land in 1826, and this land remained in the family for over 100 years before the park took it over. It's amazing when you go to these places and see the houses they lived in back then, and to think how large the families were and how they had to live, and nobody had their own room. Construction methods were kind of cool too, using nothing but hand tools, axes, saws, and being able to hew these logs into shape and notch the corners so they just rest on one another. It's amazing how little fasteners you would need. No nails, nothing like that. It's amazing the construction they could have done back then with nothing but a few hand tools. This was the attic space. I'll turn a flashlight on here in a second. It's amazing how much room there is up here. How uninsulated it was. You could see through the eaves outside. Couldn't imagine building that old stone chimney back in the day. You imagine having that view out your front porch. It sure is pretty back there. So Cades Cove was lived in by many families, not just the Oliver family. And in the 1920s, 1930s, the government bought the properties out from several people, but some didn't want to leave, and just one of those unfortunate things that ended up going to court on a couple of them, and the court sided with the government, not the families that had lived here for 2 and 3 generations. This is a primitive Baptist church. The church itself was established in 1827. This church itself was built in 1887. We also walked through the cemetery behind the church. Some really old graves there. And this is the Methodist Church. It was built by J.D. McCampbell. He was a blacksmith and a carpenter. He built it in 115 days for $115 in 1902. You notice the 2 doors there. What was interesting is this church did not do it, but some of the churches back in the day were separated by gender. The women had to sit on one side of the church, the men on the other side of church. And they borrowed these plans from another Methodist church that happened to do that, so they had 2 doors, but this church just used those plans and ended up building a church with 2 doors, even though they did not do that. Sure was pretty back here. Some of the trees really had a huge pop of color. Elijah Oliver was a descendant of John Oliver. He was born here in the Cove in 1824. He left prior to the Civil War, but came back and bought this piece of property after the Civil War. This barn was actually built not too long before the 1920s, 1930 buyout of his property. He was one of them that fought in court, but unfortunately failed to keep his family property. And his property, the house, barns, everything that he had there was for a self-sufficient farm for him and his family. There wasn't any going to the grocery store nearby or anything like that in the area. What's interesting is when we got back here, there was a ton of vehicles stopped in the roadway. And nobody was on this small hike back to his house. We later found out there was a black bear feeding on some walnuts underneath a tree, and everybody wanted to go see the bear. So we had this hike to ourselves, the whole house. And he's got cribs for holding hay and barns to keep the milk cow safe, and on the front of the house, the folks that lived in here were known for their hospitality and would often have strangers come in, feed them, and give them a place to stay for free. And this house has a small, what they called stranger room, built off to the side so that when travelers were coming through, they could have a dry place to sleep after being fed a meal at the house, which was kind of neat. At the visitor center area, we were able to see the grist mill here and several other structures. The White House there in the back, that's the Gregg/Cable house. It was moved here to this location. It wasn't originally built here. The one thing we ended up having a lot of fun with, and I didn't film any of it, is on site there was a farmer who had his donkeys, and they were processing sorghum the old-fashioned way. They had a press that the donkeys going in circle would power, and they would feed the sorghum stalks into it, and they would get mashed up and give the syrup out, and then they would take the syrup and cook it over a wood fire. until it made the sorghum. And we tasted some there that was freshly made as we were standing there watching them, and it was amazingly good. We ended up buying a jar of it before we left. This is an interesting barn, so that what they could do is they could pull their hay wagons up into that covered area to feed hay up into the loft, and then these two outside barns were actually for the animals. I don't think I've ever seen a barn designed like that before. Then it was off to Georgia. When we came into Georgia, we were headed to Stone Mountain and went through the Atlanta area. And here you go, Atlanta traffic. We ended up getting through it not too bad, but it's always interesting to get stuck in rush hour traffic like that when you're towing a trailer behind your truck. All in all, it wasn't too bad though. And then we ended up going to our first ever Buc-ee's. I know there's some folks out there that are probably laughing about that, but we've never been to one before. We thoroughly enjoyed them. They're always clean, well kept, lots of available gas pumps. The stores are huge with selections of all kinds of stuff. And Sonia loved their cinnamon rolls. It's something we can look back and laugh at, and every time we found a Buc-ee's after this, we stopped when we needed gas or anything. I really like the Buc-ee's. Stone Mountain Park, Georgia. There's a whole lot going on at this park. They got a sky tram that goes up to the top of that dome. They've got exhibits in kind of, I guess, a museum. But while we were there, we just kind of hit it wrong on this one. There's a lot of temporary fence you see set up, and a lot of the places were closed because they were filming either a movie or a TV show in the area. So the production team was using a lot of the areas for the show, so this regular public couldn't go in and see the exhibits or some of the places that were normally open. So it's a quartz monzonite dome. The summit of that dome is 1,686 feet. That carving that you saw there is the largest bas-relief artwork in the world. It was completed in 1972 by Roy Faulkner. And it has Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson on their mounts. It's cut 42 feet deep into the side of that rock. This was another area that was unfortunately closed off for us. Normally you could drive your car across that covered bridge and go out to the island, but they were actively filming at the time, so we were unable to go out there. It was definitely kind of a bummer to have as many things closed down as there were, but just part of traveling. You don't always get to see everything you want. It is a gorgeous park. The lake was beautiful. There's a lot of things to see here. We're walking up on the Stone Mountain grist mill. I don't know if it was just the time of the year or because of the production in the area, but it was also closed, so we couldn't go inside, and it was not running. But just beautiful area. Lots of stuff to look at. Just amazing what they could do back in that time, where they could build these buildings and water wheels and properly produce, their flours and meals that they needed to cook with, and all from hand tools and water power. The ingenuity, the hard working ethics, just kind of neat to see what they were able to do back then. And crazy to think about how much of that information we've lost over the years. We just don't do things like that anymore. What I found rather interesting in the area here was this backside of the dome was actually privately owned and quarried for 24 years. They pulled rock out of here. But you look at it and it's hard to see the scars from where they cut the rock ledges out to get the old quarry stone out. And the amount of states, they have a list back here that showed all the different states that the quarried stone had been shipped to, and it was amazing how far across the country this Georgia stone had been shipped. But 24 solid years of continuous quarrying work. And there's just so much there that just amazing. He had some neat displays showing how they would have quarried the rock and how they would have broke it off into big chunks and then broke those chunks into different sizes and usable pieces, and the finishing work they would do or not do to send to different places that might finish it into a different product. A lot of work, a lot of hard, long work it took to get this stone out of the hillside and cut down into usable chunks. Sure has been quite the adventure. Been to Georgia a few times. Never to this area. This is the view outside of our campground. Awesome place to camp.